Hi, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I'm lucky enough to be talking with Joe Masilotti, who is the author of Hotwire Native for Rails developers. So welcome, Joe.
Hey, how's it going? Excited to be here.
I got to ask, this seems like yet another layer of code that's going to sit on top of Rails and has a funky name. In what way is this like an improvement, and to what extent is it just like, one more layer?
Yeah. So the big thing with Hotwire Native is that most of the framework lives on the devices, on the iOS device or on the Android device. So there's not a lot of code that you'll be adding to your Rails code base to like power these changes. You'll have bridge component code, which helps, interaction between the web views and stuff. But at a really high level, you are only opening a couple maybe JSON endpoints and tweaking the screens to look good on mobile devices. Everything else is going to live in your Swift and Kotlin code bases, where the majority of the Hotwire Native framework lives itself.
So if I have an existing app and I would like to make it look native on a phone, what actually is involved then? See, it's a native Rails app, already uses Hotwire.
Nice. Yeah. So if you have a mobile web, like responsive design or mobile format templates and stuff, you can get by with like very little changes to get a Hotwire Native app working. You'll need the native code, the wrapper, essentially, to wrap the web view that's rendering your Rails content on the client. But it's just a wrapper, right? It's just rendering your Rails content. So what you'll end up doing is tweaking really small things. Like on iOS, for example, you probably want to hide your H1s because you already have a native navigation bar that sits above the web view. So we kind of will hide those H1s, whether that's with CSS or a built-in helper that comes with Rails now, and display that H1 in the native part instead, which gives you a little bit more native look and feel. But one of the things that I recommend is don't try to recreate like an Apple-looking app. Don't try to recreate Android for Android. Like keep your web design, keep using Tailwind CSS or Bootstrap or what have you, and keep using that to make it just a mobile version of your website that happens to be on native. Most of the time, folks aren't going to notice that it's a web view. A lot of consumers, developers as customers might, for sure. But for the most part, like simple CRUD apps or backend apps or B2B apps, you can get by with a web view shoved inside of a native Chrome, so to speak, and go a really long way without having to do much on the design.
So then the benefit that's added then by the Hotwire Native is in terms of things like navigation and overall feel of the application. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. So you'll get native animation pushing from one screen to the next. The web view will slide over kind of behind the scenes to render the new content, but you'll get an animation sliding from the right to the left on iOS and Android to make it feel like a native app. And you'll get the native, you can build a native tab bar across the bottom. The big benefit that I always see with Hotwire Native is that it doesn't take over your entire app like React Native would. So if you want to build a location integration with React Native, you have to find the location plugin and make sure that works with React Native because you're writing JavaScript. With Hotwire Native sits next to the OS. So if you want to interact with the location API or the push notification API, you just write that code and then send the data over to Hotwire Native. You don't have to worry about like finding a Hotwire Native specific version of the API. You follow the regular tutorial on that native API, and then you just send the data back and forth with a bridge component or native code or what have you. So you're actually given more flexibility in what you build with your apps because there is no limit. You're not held to React Native's release cycle, or it's like if Apple releases a feature, you can use it that day in your Hotwire Native app. Same for for Android, which is I think sets it apart from the other hybrid type frameworks.
So does that mean that I have to be a Swift and a Kotlin developer to do this?
You don't have to be a Swift or a Kotlin developer, but you do need to know some Swift or Kotlin to do this. You will be writing Swift and Kotlin, Swift for iOS, Kotlin for Android. You will need to know a little bit about how the languages work and how to, run an app from Xcode or Android Studio. The way that I'm writing my book is that a Rails developer doesn't need to know anything before they get started. If you can do a Rails CRUD, know how to create a new stimulus controller, that's enough to follow along with my book. I'm building up every single piece of information you need for Kotlin and Swift as the book progresses. So it's meant for complete beginner mobile developers, maybe beginner middle tier Rails developers.
That's pretty cool. And then the fact that your book progresses in that way, does that also mean that if I'm writing a app, I could actually progressively deploy it using those kind of steps as well?
Yeah, exactly. The way that the chapters work is that you're building an example app, a hiking journal to keep track of your hikes as you progress. And chapter 1 introduces the framework at a high level. Chapter 2 makes it look a little bit cleaner. Chapter 3 adds X, Y. You keep building all of these features. But at any point after you complete chapter 1, you have a working version of your app. It's just that every chapter is adding a new progressive enhancement on top of it. One chapter will swap out a web-based map for a native map, a Swift UI map or a Jetpack Compose map on whichever platform. One chapter adds push notifications, things that you don't need but are making your app even better and feeling more native while still keeping that Hotwire Native mindset.
Yeah, and reducing your time to, quote, MVP dramatically.
Yeah, like if you really want to go MVP, you could probably read chapter 1 and then put it in the App Store. like that sometimes is enough features to get something there, because you think about it, you're just writing a wrapper. You're getting all the functionality that already exists on your Rails website for free. As long as there's a link to it from a page, the Hotwire Native apps can access it. So if you have 300 controllers, you have 300 controllers on your iOS and Android apps, because you're just a web browser with some fancy Chrome around it.
But is that actually true, or do you have to modify the structure of an existing Rails app to fit into the expected structure on a mobile device?
You do not have to modify the structure of the Rails app. The way that the iOS and Android apps frameworks will work is that some screens you'll want to present in different ways. You'll want some screens to slide in from the left and right. You want some screens to slide in from the bottom as like a form. And those you configure all of that in one big JSON file on your server. So you don't actually change any implementation of your code or your controller level. You kind of have almost like a native routes file. It's called the path configuration that directs the client of how to present different screens. And with that, you can make your app feel really native, because you can control when screen A goes to screen B, push it from the bottom. When screen B goes to C, dismiss it and reload page A. You can do all of that through this single JSON file. And because it's downloaded when the app launches, you can change it after app releases without doing a new push to the App Store. So you can dynamically change the way your app behaves on the fly.
To me, that sounds like one of the most appealing features of the whole thing is, now I can actually genuinely maintain my application without begging, which is a nice capability.
Yeah, the maintenance factor of Hotwire native apps, I think, is understated. When I worked, before I went independent, I was working for a company that got early access to one of the very first versions of what became Hotwire Native. I built the iOS and Android app, put them in the App Store and Google Play, and we didn't touch those apps for almost 2 years, the native code. But we kept releasing features on the Rails side every 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, the clients would get those features for free because it was just a website at the end of the day. It wasn't until Apple reached out to us and was like, we think your app is stagnant. You have to update it or we're removing it from the App Store. That we had to rebuild the app and resubmit it. No new features. We just had to rebuild it with the latest APIs and Swift. But the maintenance on these apps, if you don't add native features, is so low. And once you get that first version out there, your Rails developers can fix the bugs because you're fixing Rails bugs. You're not fixing native bugs. There'll be a hiccup probably the first time you deploy and, figuring all that stuff out, new technology and everything. But once you get that like baseline out there, that 1.1 usually, that sits for a long time if you want it to.
So, I mean, is it genuinely the case then that your web version of the app will just continue to run as it is? And it'll suddenly get the superpower of being also available on these mobile devices in a kind of native wrapper.
Yeah, pretty much. And that native wrapper will give you some native features on top of it. The push notifications, so to speak.
Right. But so therefore, when you are engineering an app like this, does that mean now that whenever you deploy, your testing has to involve the mobile devices as well?
Yeah, that's a tricky question because the mobile testing, like on a unit level, is really good. Xcode and Android Studio both have really good unit level testing. Android even has really good suite level testing or UI level testing. But interacting with the server, you start to get in this weird situation where you're like, okay, do I have to like spin up a server just to test the apps? And what happens on CI? Like do I hit a staging server or a pull request review server? So the way that I like to test these apps is smoke tests. I have a very high level, when I visit this page, I type in this information, I can sign in, I can sign out, and I can do like the most important functionality, like one CRUD action. And then I have all the unit tests. And those smoke tests, I don't automate. I do them kind of manually. I make sure that they work. Anytime like these 7 or 8 files are touched, I make sure to rerun them manually. But it's one of the weaknesses right now that there's not a really good answer to full suite testing with a Hotwire Native app because you're running 2 or 3 platforms at the same time.
Yeah. In practice, how often do you find it breaks?
In practice, it breaks not intentionally, but when you're about to break it. Like it's,
Okay.
it's like okay, there are a couple things to watch out for with Hotwire Native apps. Making sure you don't use data turbo false on your forms or your links and stuff like that. Or you added a new screen. Is it a modal or not a modal? There's a couple of those scenarios where it's like when you do these things, make sure to test the mobile app. But outside of those, it's rare that you'll introduce a bug that's only on the mobile app and not also on your Rails app.
Oh, wow.
Most of the time, you'll introduce a bug that's Rails code and needs to be fixed with Rails code.
That's impressive. I mean, I kind of assumed it would be that the mobile things would be more fragile and therefore something that might work on the web might not work on the mobile.
Yeah, when you start to get to a lot of native features and you're worrying about backwards compatibility with APIs and you have JSON endpoints that are only powering the mobile apps, I think that the answer changes a little bit because you want to make sure those don't break. But when you're talking MVP level or even like V2 where you're mostly rendering web-based screens, it's mostly Rails code at the end of the day. So the bugs live in the Rails code base.
Cool. And is that the path that most of these apps will take, that they'll start off being, effectively embedded Rails apps and then gradually mutate into fully blown mobile apps over a space of a couple of years? Or
Yeah, I don't know if the end goal is ever to be fully native. I think if you were going to go fully native, there might be better solutions out there, whether building it native yourself or even React Native at that point, because you're going to need all the APIs. But I do think that the path that I always recommend to my clients when I'm consulting for them is to get the most web version in the App Store as possible first, and then start slapping on features on top of that. One of the hardest parts, I think, for a Rails developer as they do mobile development is not actually writing the code. It's doing the App Store song and dance. It's working with Apple to make sure that you checked all the right boxes and secured all the right keys. It's working with Google to make sure that you set up all of your signing permissions correctly. And all of that stuff takes time. But the hard part is when you actually hit submit and Apple writes back to you and is like, rejected for reasons X, Y, and Z. And it takes you 2 weeks to deal with them to figure out like, oh yeah, I forgot to say that our business model is X, Y, whatever, So once you're in the App Store, everything becomes so much easier because those updates are faster. The review teams aren't looking at your app as closely, so things go by just more smoothly. So I always try to get a web-based app with one native feature, submit that to the App Store, and then have fun and dive into the native stuff. And that native feature is almost always push notifications because it's the biggest benefit of native apps.
And do they insist on a native feature before they'll take it?
Yeah, there's a clause in the App Store review guidelines, so you have to follow these to get into the App Store, that your app cannot simply be a wrapper around a website. It has to have some form of like a benefit over the website. And push notifications or a native tab bar are usually enough to fulfill that. I've submitted like 35 apps probably or so to the App Store by now. And I'd say that 30 of them got rejected on the first submission. But not a single one of those was because of that clause. It was always for something else. And 29 of them we ended up getting approval eventually. There's the one that always escapes me that didn't get in, but that's a different conversation.
So one thing I'm always surprised by is you hear these horror stories of, I always hear it about Apple, I'm sure the same is true of Google, that they will start rejecting apps or throwing out apps because they try and do things like, sell direct or something. They don't. If you're sitting there able to update an app without them knowing, then I'm kind of surprised they let you do that because you can presumably bypass a lot of their checks.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you sell digital services, more often than not, you'll have to use Apple's or Google's payment system in-app purchases. And they'll review your app when you submit it and on every app update and check for those things. The thing that they've added recently is they'll also do kind of splash reviews of apps every now and then, where they'll just kind of like open up your app and poke around a little bit and see what's going on. So way back when, you could probably get by with throwing some sort of payment screen in your app. Now, if you add something after the fact and they find out, you could get banned from the App Store versus them just rejecting your app during the review process and saying you need to remove this. If you add something like that breaks the guidelines, it's a much more serious offense.
So if you were something like an email client, you're running an email system or whatever it might be in the back end, and it's like a monthly subscription, and your web application just has a regular Stripe payment form or whatever it might be on it, you would have to presumably then rewrite that portion of it and use the native payment as you download onto the various devices.
Yeah, more often than not, if you're going like direct to consumer or B2C, where the person who is using the app is the person paying, you usually have to go through in-app purchases. And that's not a small lift. But if you're building a B2B or a backend app or an app where the end user is not the person paying, like their company is paying for it, you can just bypass all of that and not accept payments in the app, and it becomes a companion app. And that's where a lot of the stuff that I build is that like a B2B SaaS has, 50 users per account. The business owner pays the monthly fee. They get access to the service, and their employees can then download this mobile app. That would be something where there's just no payment at all in the mobile app because it all happens either through Stripe on your website or behind closed doors through an agreement. Apple doesn't want any part of that because it's considered a companion app.
Right. Well, when you say Apple doesn't want any part, I suspect we're saying Apple hasn't worked out a way of having a part yet.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's okay. So, I mean, right now I'm sold. There must be downsides. I mean, what are the downsides?
Yeah. The biggest downside, we kind of touched on one of the biggest downsides, is that's the in-app purchase stuff. If you're doing a traditional software thing that isn't a SaaS, that's B2B, if you're buying digital goods or whatever, building out in-app purchases and losing 30% cut to Apple and Google is a tough pill to swallow. But that'd be if you didn't use Hotwire Native and you went fully native anyway. So like, it's not really a downside of Hotwire Native versus just being in the app stores. Right. I think the biggest downside of the two biggest downsides of Hotwire Native are there's no real answer for offline access. If you need a network connection to access your server to do anything in the app. And if you visit a page and go back without internet access, you don't even get a cached version. You can't do anything without a connection to the internet. And that's something that we are, as the maintainers of the library, like figuring out maybe there's a better answer there. But right now, anything offline requires totally custom code. And that is not the case with something like React Native. React Native, you can do offline stuff because you're building everything natively, right? If you're not rendering web content. Right. So I think that's the biggest downside. The second biggest downside is that you do need to write some Swift and you do need to write some Kotlin. You're not writing Ruby on the client as much as I would love to. You are not staying in your Vim or your RubyMine or whatever. You are in Xcode and Android Studio. So you do have to dip your toes into native development a little bit. Even more so than something like React Native, where you're only writing JavaScript and you have one build step that spits out an iOS and an Android app. Like, you have three probably separate code bases with Hotwire Native, and the Rails one is huge, and the iOS and Android are very small relative, but they do still exist. And if you want to go more cross-platform, like React Native, you'd only have two code bases, right? Rails and mobile. But it doesn't really fit in with the Rails way of thinking, like everything have to be an API endpoint and stuff. So the big thing is like you have to do some native development.
Right.
There's no way around it.
But at the same time, I think that to do it properly, it sounds to me like you would have to anyway. I mean, otherwise it's really just lipstick on a pig, Yeah. I think that you can get pretty far with React Native these days in terms of building a fully native app, or even something like Flutter from Google does give you these like native interactions with one code base, but you're really no longer taking advantage of anything Rails has to offer, because every bit of data on the screen in those mobile apps has to come from a JSON endpoint. And if your Rails app isn't already spitting that out, if your Rails app is rendering HTML, you're not going to get a lot of benefit if you move to one of those frameworks. That's why Hotwire Native works so well with a standard boring Rails app. Your Rails app's rendering HTML, and your native clients are just spitting that out too. So what does that mean in terms of the amount of traffic between the servers and the devices? Is it higher or lower using JSON or HTML?
The HTML will send a heavier payload. There's JSON is only going to have the data you absolutely need. HTML will have all the markup, the CSS included, the JavaScript most likely as well. The one benefit, though, and this goes back to the early days of Turbo Links, Turbo.js is still powering every page click. So you're never you don't have to re-download the head of the HTML document every time. So if your assets don't change between pages, you're only getting the diff of the body tag. So that shortens that cycle dramatically, because you're usually only having to make one request, and then for every image, instead of re-requesting every single asset on every page load.
So I've got your book. I finished reading the book. Finished reading the book. Where do I go then? I mean, am I at this point a superhero Hotwire Native developer, or am I just beginning a journey?
I think you're somewhere in the middle. I think that you have enough knowledge to take your existing Rails app, wherever that may be, and get it in the app stores. I think you have all the tools you need to go that whole path. You know how to fix the bugs. You know how to do the native features you want, authentication, push, bridge components, native screens. You have all of that under your belt. But I don't think that you're an expert in the field yet. And I think that that really comes with applying the techniques that are taught in the book to do more and exciting things. For example, there's one interaction where we are diving into the push notification API, and it's triggered through a JavaScript request on the server, something called a bridge component, and that sends JSON to the client, and then you request notifications on the client, right? That interaction with the notification API could be swapped out for anything. It could be swapped out for getting data from HealthKit, or from getting data from any number of native API. And you don't need to read through the book to know how to do each of those. You know the approach to following and interacting with any native API. So I think that that's where you really start to become like this expert developer in the space, where you can touch on multiple different native APIs and be like, oh yeah, I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. And that's like the next level. I also think that there's just a lot of opportunity for converting screens to be from web to native. Because there's always like, syncing issues and background loading and how are we persisting this data to the device and stuff like that isn't covered in the book because it's mostly focused on web. That when you build something more than like your V1 or even V2, you'll start to really quickly see. And again, I think you have the tools you need from the book to approach that, but maybe not feel comfortable with it right at the beginning.
Sure. I can see that. So would that be, so you have your web app rendering effectively HTML, and then you would add more native goodness that could then be talking JSON, for example, back to the server. Is that the way
Exactly.
you see that going? Okay.
Yeah, like your home screen to be native, or a screen somewhere down in the stack that you want to render natively because it has a lot of fun interactions on it, like that type of stuff. And you're progressively enhancing those screens because there already exists a web version of it.
Or there could be interactions which are not on the screen, like be talking to a ring or a watch or something.
Yeah, Bluetooth interactions, or vibrating the device, or playing sounds, or accessing the gyro and all those type of stuffs in the device, like that you can't at all or can't easily do from the web. That's where things, your app elevates from just a wrapper to a really full native experience.
That is so cool. So just to summarize then, if I'm a Rails developer and I would like to enhance the mobile experience for my applications, then looking at Hotwire Native is a relatively low barrier to entry of getting my things to look and feel more like native applications on mobile devices. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that there is a learning curve. I think that learning curve is a little steep, but I think that it's a short hill. I mean, MVPs can be done in like 15 lines of Swift. like it's wild, right. And like maybe you wouldn't get allowed in the App Store for that because there's no native features, but like that is what the bare bones thing is. And once you get there, you start to really see what's possible. And then you're excited about like, oh my God, I can do everything now.
Right.
So yeah.
That's so seriously cool. So, and in terms of like getting a helping hand doing that, I get the impression that that's kind of your business. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've been independent for a number of years now, focused almost exclusively on Hotwire Native development. It's been called different things throughout the years, but I help clients go from Rails app to App Store. So I take their Rails service and bundle it in an iOS or Android app. I do all the coding, or I can come into the company and like run a workshop to level up developers. And I also do this thing where I just advise. I'm kind of like a senior developer on call when you run into a problem. It's really helpful for companies that want to keep all that knowledge in-house. I'm just there to kind of ask questions and pair program with and all that stuff.
No, that sounds ideal because they don't rely on you. But, you're there as a safety net, really, in terms of,
And I've submitted 35 apps to the App Store at this point. Like I've seen so many problems and so many common pitfalls that I'm able to spot those during the submission process with these clients or these companies, instead of after Apple rejects our app or after Google's like, deny or whatever. So I have a lot more insight than someone who is kind of just getting started.
Right. It's kind of like going to a strange company and getting a guide to show you around.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, this has been an absolute pleasure. And you've probably just ruined my next 6 months as I go away and see about converting our stuff into this. But really exciting. And I really appreciate taking the time to talk with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be on, and thanks for having me.